So last time we talked about Gregor Mendel, and the bottom line of that whole lecture was that Mendel really discovered that genetic information comes in some sort of packets of information. He didn't know what it was. These packets came to be known as genes, and the whole study was known as genetics. And we saw that his papers were really just discovered in 1900. And for 50 years, there was really no progress made on the kind of molecular details of it, but people did learn a lot about how genes behaved. So one of the main things is that looking at cells, they soon figured out that the genes must be in the chromosomes. So something they could actually see seemed to be inherited, evenly divided. The genes must be there. And they knew that the chromosomes were made out of protein and DNA. They didn't know much about the structure of these at all. And it made a lot more sense for it to be the protein because that was more complex. The DNA didn't seem likely, but there was evidence both ways. But the question of what was the actual structure of these molecules and how would that answer the basic question of how do you use a molecule to encode information to make a whole creature? And how is that information just replicated so faithfully generation after generation? When we got to 1950, we knew almost nothing about the answer to those two questions. And the huge breakthrough was really in discovering the structure of DNA, finding out that it was what genes are made of, and had a good idea of how it might encode information and how it might be replicated. The people who did this, the kind of key breakthrough, are the three people that we see on this slide: Francis Crick, Rosalyn Franklin, and Jim Watson. And today I'm going to tell you about the early years of these. I'm going to tell you about how they got their training, what they were motivated to do in life, and take you up to the point where they all converged together and started on this project in their own difficult ways of explaining what the structure of DNA was and what that might tell us about the nature of the gene. Okay, so I'm going to come back here to just talk to you without the slides for a few minutes here. So let's start with Crick, because he was the firstborn. He was the oldest of this group. So Francis Crick was born in 1916, and he was born in the English Midlands in Northampton. His father owned a shoemaking company. And they were, at the beginning at least, fairly well off. So he grew up with, as he described it, the habits and the memories of the well-off middle class. His father actually lost much of his money. The factory didn't succeed. But he had an uncle who continued to be quite wealthy, and that provided some financial support for Crick through most of his life. I mean, through his early life. So he was never really a deprived person. He did well in his early education, but he was not an obvious prodigy in the same way that we'll see that Franklin and Watson were prodigies. So Crick got a scholarship to a boarding school for the sort of elementary grades. I think he left at the age of 11. Went to North London to a school called Mill Hill. Did well there. He was seen as an extrovert, a bit eccentric perhaps, and more of this will come up. So when he applied to, got through the equivalent of high school, he really wanted to go on to the university. And of course, the ultimate goal would be to get into Oxford or Cambridge. He applied, he did not succeed. He didn't get into the major universities. But he went to a very good university. He went to the University College in London and majored in physics. So the degree program was a 3-year program, kind of our equivalent to a bachelor's degree. And in the end, they have to take these exams. It's a rather different system than the American system. And the goal obviously is to get a first, to be, among the best in the class. Crick got a second. All right. So he was a smart guy, but he had his quirks. So he got a second class degree in physics. He wanted to pursue it though. And so he continued on at University College in London, and he went into the PhD program in physics. And let me say that this is a major theme in the discovery of the gene in this era, that much of what we learned about the real hardcore molecular detail came from people who were ex-physicists. And you'll hear this come up again and again as we talk about these people. So his project as a physicist to get a PhD was what he called the dullest problem imaginable. And that is, what his mentor wanted him to do was to measure the viscosity, the thickness of water at very high pressure. And that's what he did. He built an apparatus and said, if you put water under much, much pressure, does it get thicker or thinner? He did some good work. He won a prize, but he described it himself as a complete waste of time. So he didn't finish the degree. He did not get the PhD because 1939, Crick is 23 years old, and World War II starts in Britain, in London, and he's in the middle of it. So what happened is that much of the university moved its people and some of its apparatus, et cetera, to Wales to avoid the bombing during the beginning of World War II. But Crick stayed on in London, and as with so many people, he got a war-related job. He got a job with the Admiralty. And because he was a PhD student in physics, he really spent his time in a research setting. So his project in World War II was to try to deal with the German minesweepers. So the Germans had this way of sending out this electromagnetic pulse that would trigger the British mines and blow them up. And it was such a powerful pulse that they would send out, that if the mine was, several hundred yards in front of the ship, it would go off as the ship approached it, as the German ship approached it, and explode without sinking the minesweeper or any other ship. So they were defeating Britain's defenses. And what Crick did, he was only 23 years old as he started this job, he figured out, well, what we'll do is we'll always put some mines out there that are very insensitive, that they won't respond unless they get a really terrific electromagnetic signal. And so the German minesweepers would come in, they'd send out their signal, and they might set off some mines, but they wouldn't set off this other insensitive one until the minesweeper got right on top of it. And then the signal was strong enough and it exploded and it'd sink the minesweeper. And this was very successful. Apparently the British sunk, the book says, hundreds of German minesweeping ships due to this really invention that Crick had thought of as a very young guy at the beginning of World War II. So he became a team leader. He was obviously very bright. He was described as a kind of tall, sandy-haired guy with a slight stoop. He had an immense sense of fun. He was, and this came up frequently in people memories of Crick, is that he would burst out into this high-pitched laugh, described as more like a bray of a donkey. So some people found this amusing, some people found it irritating. We'll see. So when he was 24, he had been involved with an undergraduate at the University College London, and he got married. He married a woman named Doreen Dowd. She was in fellow undergraduate. And within a year or two later, they had a son. However, just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, in 1945, just as the war was ending, he met another woman. uh, he and Doreen had somewhat separated, and the other woman was described by one of the authors as she was much that Crick was not. She was artistic, she was cosmopolitan, she was well-traveled. Her name was Odile. Oh, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but Odile, Odile. Her mother was French, her father was British, but Odile spoke fluent French, and she also spoke fluent German. And so in World War II, I mean, she's English, but her mother was from France. So in World War II, what happened with Odile is at first she joined the RINS, this is the Women's Army Corps, and she was driving trucks for a few months, but then they found out she could speak fluent German, especially. And she spent 3 years listening to German radio messages for the British and translating them. So anyway, when she met Crick, Francis Crick, the report was that she was dubious about him. Among other things, he was separated from his previous wife, but still married. He had a son. The science interest that Crick had did not interest her, but somehow he was eccentric and appealing, and they got together, and to jump ahead even further, they ended up being together for 60 years. It was a very good match. And she played a kind of important role in this whole relationship among all these discoverers. So 1946, the war ends. What is Crick going to do with himself? He still doesn't have a PhD, but he decided he'd apply to be a civil servant in naval intelligence. He'd stay on. And when he applied at first, they turned him down. But he had a second interview, and one of the people on the panel for the second interview was C.P. Snow. Maybe people remember, he was a novelist, very famous, eminent novelist, wrote especially about academic life and science, etc. And this panel for the second interview changed their mind and said that no, Crick was he's eccentric, but he was a very smart guy. So they hired him. However, Crick quickly decided that the civil service bureaucracy was not for him, and he really disliked it. So here he is, he's 30 years old. He's got a half-finished PhD. He's bored with the physics that he's doing. So what's he gonna do with himself? He was an avid reader. He was looking around to see what in the world might be interesting. And among other things, he read a book that turns out to be very important in the development of molecular biology. And it was a book called What is Life? And was written by a very eminent physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, Schrödinger's wave equation. Anyway, Schrödinger wrote this little pamphlet that we'll see references to many times, where physicists especially wrote it. And here's this physicist saying, you know, the really interesting question out there is, what is the basic molecular chemical basis of life? So Crick found this very appealing, and he decided, you know what he wanted to do? He wanted to find out the secret of life. All right. So at this time, among other things, he met a man named Maurice Wilkins. And really, Wilkins also almost could be, should be, you know, the fourth biography in this whole story, because he plays a key role. But he, in a way, he was always just a little bit on the periphery, as you'll hear. But let me just tell you a little bit about Wilkins. One thing interesting about him is that if he and Crick kind of became friends and became friends forever, and they were both born in 1916, and they both died in the exact same year, which was 2004. They were both very long-lived. Wilkins, interestingly, was born in New Zealand, but you know, as part of the empire, came back to Britain. His father, Wilkins's father, was a doctor. His mother was one of the first women who went to Cambridge. So he was from a very educated family. Like Crick, he got a second-class degree in physics, but he completed his and got it from Cambridge. World War II for Wilkins was spent in Berkeley because he was a physicist and he was part of the Manhattan Project. But then he also read Schrodinger's What is Life book and said, biology, that's pretty interesting. And so he started using his physics in the kind of newly developed technique of crystallography, which could allow you to look at molecular structure, and decided to work on the crystallography of DNA. And that's why he's much connected to this story. So he'll come back to him. But when Crick met Wilkins, Wilkins said, yeah, I'm like you, I'm a physicist, but I'm really interested in these biological questions. And, Crick had been doing a lot of reading in his spare time. He'd been reading chemistry. He'd been reading biology. He knew that the gene appeared to be on chromosomes, but it was still an abstract principle. Most people thought genes must be proteins. So he decided, I'm going to try to get into the best place. I'm going to try to get into Cambridge and get associated with these biology people who are doing genetics. And that's the way I can find the secret of life. So he applied for positions, and remember, he's still a PhD student. The work he had done in the war was remembered by people at Cambridge. They knew he was a very bright guy. And so he had some trouble finding a specific position, but he did get accepted. And he ended up in a place called Strangeway Labs. Now, Strangeways got its name because it was founded and paid for by Dr. Strangeways in 1905. And they were trying to develop new methods in biology, one of which to be able to culture human cells. Could you actually take a piece of somebody's finger and grow it in a petri dish? And we know that we can do that readily for many kinds of cells, but in the early days, that was a tricky technique to develop. So he got involved in that, and from that work, he published 2 long and generally perceived as not very good scientific papers, and it kind of followed up his earlier physics work, which was on the viscosity of water. These papers were on the viscosity of the fluid in cells. And he thought, this is not going to tell us what the gene is. And he was right. So he was not yet convinced that genes were made of DNA, but he was leaning in that direction. So he met another friend, a mathematician, and this was in 49, a mathematician who knew the group who were studying structural biology at Cambridge. And this was in a famous lab there, the Cavendish Laboratories. Cavendish Laboratories were the home of like Maxwell, who invented some of the key thermodynamic equations and all of physics. J.J. Thomson, who did important stuff like discover the electron. Rutherford, one of the originators of particle physics, etc. So Crick's friend said, I know a guy there, and he's working on these crystallographic methods to study proteins, and you should go there. That's probably the leading place. And so Crick abandoned his Strangeways PhD project and launched into PhD project number 3. Remember, he had University College London, then there was the war, then Strangeways. So he joined this team at the Cavendish lab, hoping to get a PhD. The project was, let's pick some small protein and see if we can use this X-ray method to determine its structure. I mean, at this point, for a complicated molecule like a protein, this had not yet been done. And so he started to learn this technique of X-ray crystallography. And let me say, I'm not going to go into that today, but next time when we talk about what Crick and Watson and Franklin were doing, using X-ray crystallography. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It's a very challenging thing to understand. It really involves understanding the mathematics to really understand it. But we can get a little intuitive sense that I'll come to next time. But one thing that happened with Crick in his learning this new method is he said, and this was from one of his own mentors, he said, I soon found that I could see the answer to many of these mathematical problems by a combination of imagery and logic without first having to slog through all the mathematics. And this seemed to be something that Crick could kind of uniquely do. He could look at these X-ray patterns and get some sense of the overall nature of the crystal and kind of visualize in his mind how these atoms might be going together. And that was just a key in the discovery of structure of DNA that we're heading towards. So at this point, Crick is 35 years old. He's at the Cavendish. He's in a good place. He's got a problem that's interesting to him. He's working on the proteins. And let me just kind of read you a couple of things from, this is Matt Ridley's book on Crick, just to kind of summarize what we know about Crick at this point. So among other things, I told you he was a bit eccentric, etc. And this caused some problems there. One reason this was such a good lab is that the director of the lab, Lawrence Bragg, was the person who had won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how to use X-rays to figure the structure of small molecules. He shared the prize with his father, who had also worked on this process. But so Bragg was the head of this whole laboratory, and he worked with a protein crystallographer named Mac Perutz. So here's where Crick stood then. So Bragg and Perutz needed the patience of saints to put up with this loudmouth, Crick, with the braying laugh, who was much better at telling them what was wrong with their science than with actually making the measurements himself. All right. So, and just a little bit more. So the upshot of Crick's first 2 years at the Cavendish Laboratory was therefore that he was acknowledged, even by Bragg, as a good theoretician, though he was correspondingly not of much use in the lab and was not apt to see things through. He was an irritating presence because of what Bragg called his habit of doing other people's crosswords. In other words, oh, what are you working on? Oh, here's the answer to this, etc. That can be very irritating. All right. As well as freely criticizing their best ideas. But he had learned some useful lessons about the need for simplifying assumptions and the importance of visualizing reality as well as analyzing it. So he had found his place. He's found his technique. It wasn't clear yet that he was going to be able to bring his project to his third PhD project to completion. So in 1951, into his office, he met this young American guy named Jim Watson. And then they shared an office and they started talking. And what they did is something we're going to go into next time. So let me just show you just a few pictures relating to Crick. Okay, so we go here. Okay, so isn't it sweet? So this is Francis Crick when he was 5 years old. He looks very British there, doesn't he? You know, light hair, etc. And when he sort of like a young high school student, this was Mill Hill School, boarding school in North London. He looks very studious here, almost with a cane, but with a walking stick. All right. And this was the woman he married the second time and with whom he stayed married for almost 60 years. This is Francis Crick and Odalie on their wedding day. And here he is about the time when Watson came into his office. Crick was a little older. Crick was the oldest of our trio here. As I said, born in 1916. So he's probably about 36 years old at this point. This is just about when they were completing the double helix work. Okay, so with that, all right, I'm going to open this to questions. People have questions about Francis Crick. All right, and any of this early work here. Anything? Okay, Harriet? Oh, you're muted, yeah.
It seems that these scientists were British. Was there something about Cambridge and British science at the time that allowed them to develop these insights?
Well, it's an interesting question. There was much going on in the US, and this will be part of our story. There were major centers in the US at this point, and Linus Pauling, who was working at Caltech, was the competitor for the Cavendish lab. It's going to be part of our story. But it's true that the two places in the world really that were dominating science at this point were Oxford and Cambridge and London. And then in the US, it was kind of New York and the East Coast in California. And then even some of the places in the Midwest. Why that's so, I don't have a good answer, but it was really very good. Okay, all right, well, let's move on then to our second person. And this is Rosalyn Franklin. Now, I must say, my instincts are to pronounce her name Rosalind with 3 syllables. I think she may have pronounced it just Rosalind, but I'm not going to be able to say something other than Rosalind. So she was born in 1920. So she was 4 years younger than Crick. Very interesting family background. She was from a very eminent English Jewish family. So the family name had been, instead of Franklin, had been anglicized from Frankel in Silesia in Europe, but they had moved over in the 1760s. All right, so they were generations in England. Her uncle, who was Sir Herbert Samuel, was installed as the first High Commissioner of Palestine in 1920, in the year that Rosalyn was born. And the family was very close to this family, the uncle. One of her uncles was a Viscount. So in the British class system, Rosalyn was definitely upper class. And it was noted that she had an upper class accent. So people would know that she was in the upper class. All right. Family ties were always important. Interestingly, she always saw herself as European. And in a way, she identified more as a European than as English. She said she liked Europeans more than she liked the English. Her father, Ellis Franklin, was a banker who worked in London. And he was quite successful, although not hugely wealthy. There were some other members of the family that had big country estates, but her family did not. Her mother was Muriel, and her mother was always supportive, a bit of a worrier. She was always worrying about whether Rosalyn was really going in the right route, being this single, independent woman. All right, but very supportive. And because the family had some money, Rosalyn was also very much raised by a nanny. The nanny's name was Ada Griffins, and Rosalyn was always loyal to her, and the nanny was always loyal to Rosalyn. They kept in touch their whole lives. So right from the beginning, she was seen, in the British word, as clever. She was a very bright person. And one of her aunts in a letter noted that they had gone on a family vacation, and when Rosalyn was 7 years old, the aunt said she, quote, spends all her time doing arithmetic for pleasure. All right, so she had 3 brothers, but even according to her father, she was felt that Rosalind, little Rosalind, was the brightest of the family. Later on, there was another child to a younger sister. All right. However, interestingly, although her father saw her as very bright and was supportive of Rosalind through his whole life, at this time he allowed no female employees at his bank. He had only men working there. He did not employ women. And so this was this very kind of mixed message background that she grew up in. At the age of 5, because the family had some money, they took a trip to France. And for Rosalind, it was the start of really a lifelong love of travel. Rosalind loved travel, and she loved traveling in wild places. So, as would be the British tradition, at the age of 9, she was sent away from home. She was sent to boarding school. So she went to the Lindoris School for Young Ladies, which was on the Sussex coast. It was, of course, a proper Christian school. And so one of the problems was that when most of the girls went off to the required church services, she had to do her Hebrew lessons. Now, her family regularly went to synagogue. They were practicing Jews. They were not Orthodox, but this was an important part of their culture. Now, Rosalind was clever, and she was a very diligent student. She was often the top student in her class. This was important to her. She was very competitive about these things, and she really worked on her schooling. So you can think tonight when she was 11 years old, this is 1932, which is the depths of the Depression. I mean, one interesting thing here is all of our 3 people here were kind of Depression era children, and to some extent. When she was 11 years old, she was sent to another school from the ladies' school she was sent to St. Paul's, which was a London day school. Here she could live at home, but go to St. Paul's. And this was considered a very good school for people of Rosalind's class. The girls were all called Paulinas. She liked St. Paul's very much. I mean, it was a very academically rigorous school, and she did well in a competitive environment. She also formed friends here. She formed lifelong friends that she kept in touch with and were supportive of her. So it was there at age 16 that she really started science courses. She avoided biology, interestingly. I mean, she focused on chemistry and physics. So this is yet another one of those physicists who got involved in these biological problems, and math. She was very good at math. During this time, when she was 17, the family took a trip to Norway and went hiking in the mountains. And for her, this was a long love, start of a long love of hiking in wild places. She loved to go out into the mountains. So the idea, even though Rosalind was born in this upper class family, the idea of taking a pack and a sleeping bag and going out and sleeping in the woods was something that she loved to do, and did this much of her life. All right, so she got to 17. It was a little early, but she decided a year early she was going to take the entrance exam for Cambridge. And this was the beginning of a pattern. If you read her letters, she took the exam. She wrote the family how badly she had done, that she just felt that she had just completely blown it. But she, of course, had misjudged it. She had, in fact, gotten a first in chemistry. She was awarded a scholarship, and so she left St. Paul's a year early, and at 17 went off to Cambridge University. Now, she was a woman, of course, so she just didn't get into the real Cambridge. She went to Newnham College, Newnham, and with the British proclivity to ignore a lot of the letters, it's called Newman. Newnham, that's the proper way to pronounce it, Newnham. I'll show you a picture of it in a bit here. So the women were not considered Cambridge undergrads. And interestingly, even though it was a Cambridge college, they were not eligible for a formal Cambridge degree, but they would receive what was called a titular degree in Cambridge. It's like the same thing, but they just couldn't bring themselves to recognize it as a full-fledged Cambridge degree. Now she excelled at Cambridge. She really did well, even though when she got to the point where she, at the end of 2 years, she decided she was going to try to do the exams that you would normally do at the end of 3 years. She wrote to her mother telling that she had really made a mess of her 3rd year exams. In fact, she misjudged badly. She'd finished again at the top, and they allowed her to finish the 3-year program early. So 1938, she is 28 years old, and World War II, 1938, Britain. So what she did is she was continuing through the university at this time, and she took 1940, when she was finally kind of taking her final exams, she was doing it just as the British were evacuating Dunkirk, kind of at the middle of the war. So this affected, the lives of these Brits very much. It was during this time that, whereas Crick had met Maurice Wilkins, who was important in his future, she went to a lecture on Marie Curie, and the lecturer was a French physicist woman named Adrienne Weil, W-E-I-L-L. And the lecture was given in French, which Rosalyn understood. And she got to meet this woman here, and she proved to be a friend and really an important influence for Rosalyn. She really provided important advice and connections. So when all of this was done as far as her exams, once again, she got a first in physical chemistry. She got a scholarship. She got a research grant. Now, one interesting thing about, Rosalyn's personal life, this is the book here, really interesting, Roslyn Franklin, The Dark Lady of DNA by Brenda Maddox. Highly recommend this book. This is one interesting thing that she talks about her Cambridge years. She says that what 3 years at Cambridge did not do was to end Rosalyn's astonishing ignorance about sex. This is the sex part of the course here. Rosalyn confessed to her cousin Irene, who had just become engaged and came to visit her that summer, that she, Rosalyn, had never been kissed. The talk turned to having babies. The cousins discovered that although each knew vaguely how a baby was born, neither knew how the ovum was fertilized. A few months later, Irene informed Rosalyn that her fiance had enlightened her. Rosalyn was wiser too. She had asked a medical student. Right, so the question of kind of Rosalyn's love life and such is, it's a bit mystery, a bit of a mystery. I'll be pursuing it as we go along. But the bottom line is she did in the end develop some interest. Okay, so the research project that she got the scholarship for to Rosalyn was not interesting. This was now 1940, 41. The war was just at its beginnings, very much so. And she was not interested in it, and she was annoyed that it was not war work. She wasn't really doing things to help the war. So she also got into an argument with her mentor, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, and said that her mentor was wrong about one of the aspects of their projects. The mentor had made a prediction, and Rosalyn said, no, you were wrong about this. It turned out that Roslyn was correct. He was wrong about it, but this was the wrong thing to say. They argued. And so Roslyn left that lab. So she got a position at, this is not to me the most exciting place in the world, but it was the British Coal Utilization Research Association. It was called BCURA, Bukura. Anyway, this worked out to be a very good thing for Roslyn. So what she was investigating was the structure of different kinds of coal. You have anthracite coal and other kinds of coal. And people knew from industrial applications that different kinds of coal could just be turned into different products. So for example, one thing that was industrial and very important was the making of graphite. And some coals would make graphite. You ground them up, you could get graphite, like in a pencil, graphite. But other kinds of coal, they just wouldn't form the same structure. And so this was a physical biochemistry problem. How does a piece of coal differ from one mine to the other? And what's the underlying structure of that? So she investigated the structure of coal. And it was this research that really led to her degree. And so in 1945, she got a PhD. All right, so she continued this work and became a real expert. And it was also during this time that she really continued this friendship with Adrienne Wells, the woman from France. And it was through her that in 1947, the war is now over, Rosalyn got the job of her dreams. It was in a basic research lab, a physical chemistry lab that was doing research on coal in Paris. And so she moved to Paris. She got a large room on the left bank. She didn't make much money. She was making £5, 5 British pounds a week. Her mother, Muriel, was very concerned about how she was going to live on £5 a week. But Rosalyn loved it. She had before, and she developed further, a real interest in food, a real interest in clothes. And she was in arguably the best place in the world if you were interested in food and clothes, and you were in a research position with a certain degree of independence in an area in which you were becoming an expert. So it was a wonderful spot for her. In many ways, it was among the high points of her life. So the lab she went into was directed by a man named Jacques Mering, M-E-R-I-N-G. And it was there that she was introduced to X-ray crystallography. They were using this to study basic minerals like the kinds you found in coal. And the story was that Mering, the lab director, the quote was, "All the girls were in love with Mering." All right. So Mering had a wife, but no one ever saw her, including apparently Mering. And it's not clear where she was. He was legally married, but they were separated. She was off somewhere. Mering had a life of his own. It's France, Paris. Come on. And Rosalind quickly became his best student. She was very bright and she really did well. So in that lab scientifically, she really flourished. It was focused on the pure research analysis of the structure of coal. She started publishing a number of papers and she developed a reputation, an international reputation as a young up and coming scientist who really knew a lot about this industrial important area. So in 1950, Rosalind had been there for 2 years. It was a fellowship after all, with a limited amount of time. It was going to run out. She had to find a real job or some way to continue. So she started looking for research positions back in England. She really wanted to stay in the research area. She got offered a 3-year fellowship because of her expertise and her recognized, reputation in this area. She got a 3-year fellowship, but she got it postponed for a year because she was so reluctant to leave France, and she debated back and forth, should she return to England or should she not? But in the end, her wish to become an independent scientist won out, and she had a position there. It's important to remember that in 1950, England and all of Europe was in really pretty desperate straits. There was not a lot of money around. Things were rationed. Jobs were hard to find. So you kind of took what you could get. So her offer had been from King's College, which was part of the University of London. And the head of the lab was a very eminent member of the Royal Society called J.T. Randall. It's interesting, he was a real lefty. I mean, probably a card-carrying communist. I was trying to really work on better relations with Stalin and the Soviet Union, et cetera. And among other things, he was very supportive in some ways of women scientists. So he had an unusually large number of women working in fairly independent positions at King's College. So after her extra year in France, she reluctantly returned to England. And she met Randall, who was the head of the lab, and she went there with the assumption that she was going to work under Randall, and it was going to be relating to her work on the structure of coal. However, the arrangement at King's College was really unclear from the very beginning. So when she arrived, and also in a letter that she was sent right at the beginning, Randall said, no, we're switching our focus. We're not going to work on coal. We're going more towards biology. And there's just really a lot of interest in this DNA molecule. And we're going to work on DNA. And she was told in a letter that she would be the only crystallographer. And she was going to be given a graduate student, a man named Ryan Gosling. This graduate student had been working for Maurice Wilkins. Maurice Wilkins was Crick's friend. Maurice Wilkins was at King's College. Maurice Wilkins was working on DNA. And he had said to Randall, look, we need to get somebody who really knows crystallography in here. And Wilkins was the person who actually kind of said, let's get her in here and let's not have her working on coal. Let's have her working on DNA. So when she came and she met Randall, Randall said, you're our crystallography. This is your project. I'm giving you the student that worked with Wilkins. And early on, the DNA that they needed to work on, which they did not have the techniques to isolate themselves. They had a good batch of DNA that they'd gotten from a Swiss chemist. That DNA is going to go to you, Rosalyn, also. This is going to be your project. Now, interestingly, this is what Randall told her, and it's not just hearsay, it's in a letter, but he didn't tell Wilkins that. So it got into this very difficult position where Rosalyn felt that this was her project. She was an independent scientist. Wilkins felt that he had, and Wilkins, by the way, was the deputy. He was the number 2 person under Randall. Wilkins thought that Rosalyn was working for him. And this became the source of a lot of friction and hostility that plays a central role in our whole story here. Now, the other thing is, with all of this great independence that she was told she would have, she was also informed of the customs of the college. For example, there was the King's Senior Commons room where the men ate lunch and had their gatherings, but she was not to go there. Women were not allowed in the King Senior's Commons. And this is just bizarre with Randall's support of women and scientists. Somehow he just couldn't take that extra step of a sort of full equivalence. So in 51, Randall introduced her to her new graduate student, Ryan Gosling, and they subsequently got along very well, and Ryan Gosling became very much a defender and loyalist to Rosalyn for his whole career. And as I said, not present in these initial meetings was Wilkins, who had worked on DNA for years. So it was all a very difficult relationship and become rather hostile. So as Rosalyn arrived, she got new equipment. She knew what to get. She ordered this X-ray beam and the photographic equipment, good new equipment. She got the good DNA that Wilkins had, and she started getting interesting X-ray photos. So towards the beginning of the first year, she was asked to give a seminar. This is a typical thing in the university. You give a talk. It's generally open to the public, but most of the people come are academics in the same area. November of 1951, she gave a presentation at King's College on the progress she had made with DNA. And sitting in the back of the room, she did not notice him, was a 23-year-old American who had just newly arrived in England and at Cambridge. And it was Jim Watson. And he heard what she had to say, and he thought, this is really interesting. And we're going to pick up from that part of the story next time. But let me just show you a few pictures now relating to Rosalyn. Okay. So, okay, so we finished with Crick. And so it's Roslyn Franklin. This is her. She's the tallest one. And this is with all of her siblings. So her three brothers and her little sister here. I guess, I don't know, how old is she there? 10, 12, something like that. And this is her father. Not a very good picture, but just illustrates the point that they really like to go out and have hikes and go to the mountains. And as I said, she did this while she was in France too. She took several long vacations in France and went climbing in the Alps. Had a wonderful time. I think here she was in the sort of mountains of Norway, in the woods. So her college, Newnham College, and I think this is as it exists today. It is still there, and Rosalyn Franklin is, I think, their most eminent alumnus. Okay, and here is the group in France. This is Rosalyn here, and this is Mering. And people who study their history want to know if we should put any meaning into the idea that Mering is carrying Rosalyn's handbag. You know, for a man, that's quite a significant thing to be able to carry a woman's handbag. And, you know, other men don't want you to see you carrying a handbag. And these were the people in the lab. And these were just the 3 wonderful years for her because she felt very independent and supported. And she just liked to go to French restaurants and smoke cigarettes. Bad habit that she had, but she did it. And find nice clothes and eat good food, and habits that stuck with her for the rest of her life. So when she went back to King's, returning from France, King's was rather more drab and the facilities not nice, and it just, London was nice, but it wasn't Paris. Okay, this was a picture of the inside of her lab. You can see she's got a few kind of structure. These are diagrams of molecular structures. And then we come next to our next player, our final player for the day, who's Jim Watson. Okay, so questions on Rosalyn or any of this? Anybody? Okay.
I want to say something.
Yes.
I didn't realize it till this minute, or this talk, but I knew very well Rosalyn's cousin, David Solomon, who was a chemist and who lived next door to me a year that both of us were in Berkeley. And so I became really good friends with him. with his wife. He was at Weizmann Institute and he was a chemist, and I think a pretty good one. But he is now a member of the House of Lords because he inherited that position from his father. He's the first Israeli to serve on the House of Lords. But it interests me, that was 1971. And his wife, whom I spent a tremendous amount of time, never mentioned Roslyn. I'm sure I never heard of her. But it seems like she was mentionable at that time, wasn't she?
Oh, absolutely. 71.
Yes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. I kept touch with them for a while, but then I lost it. And when I was in Israel, they were already back living in England again. But it's interesting for me to know that. I just hadn't realized that.
Well, that's great, Lois, because that means like 4 degrees of separation. I could say
That's right.
Rosalyn,
Yes,
because I know you.
absolutely. Yeah.
It's only 3 degrees. Okay.
Pretty funny, yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about this?
Yeah.
Oh.
So
Go ahead.
sort of following the degrees of separation.
Yeah.
My wife is going to run out of the room here in a minute.
Yeah, I was talking to Ron and he's decided to present the question, I think. Go ahead.
So her father was born in 1916 in England as well.
In Greenwich. You suppose they knew each other?
That's the question.
Okay, same year. All right.
Yeah.
Same as her. Yep. Okay, Harriet.
Just wondering about her death. Was it the cigarettes that did her in or the x-rays?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that, but so Harriet's talking about the fact that she dies rather early of ovarian cancer. One almost hesitates to say, but this particular kind has a very high incidence rate in Ashkenazi Jews. There are some, and there's this BRCA1 mutation. I don't know if they knew whether she had it, but it's really quite prevalent in that population. Could have been the combination of the 3. It really could be. We'll never know. Okay, any other question? All right, so let's go to our third and final character in this developing drama here.
Can I just interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Since you mentioned that she passed away of that, how old was she when she passed away? Do you know?
I think either 37 or 38.
37.
Oh my.
Yep.
37? Wow.
Barry,
Wow.
Yeah.
Barry,
Yes.
this is Jenna. Do you think she would have gotten the prize had she not passed so young? Had she not been dead at the time the other 2 got the prize?
Really interesting question. I think there's a very good chance, yes. Because as we'll, well, let me say, I think yes, and ask me again when we get to the end.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so our last player, Jim Watson. And in many ways, he was the central figure. I mean, he's a quirky guy, but probably without Watson, the story would not have happened. So he was the youngest of the group, and Jim Watson is still alive today. Jim Watson was born in 1928. So Watson is 92, I think, today. He was born in Chicago. Chicago played an important role in his life. And Jim Watson is the one who has written the most about this whole story and the history. And so we have a lot of kind of view of this story from Jim Watson's point of view. And in fact, that's one of the kind of intriguing aspects of this whole deal, to the extent to which Jim Watson has been able to shape the story. I want to talk a little bit about that when we get to the final lecture here. So what he said about himself was that he was born into a family that believed in books, birds, and the Democratic Party. Right. So he was in a good section of New York, close to the University of Chicago. And in his preschool, kindergarten, et cetera, he went to the laboratory school at the University of Chicago. But then in 1928, he was born, 1 year later, the Great Depression. And so as the Depression came in, it did affect his family, but he still was living in a nice neighborhood, and he went to a public school from the age of 5 to 13, but it was a very good elementary school. One point when reading his memoir, which I hadn't realized, that his grandfather at one point owned a hotel in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which was curious to me because my sister lives in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I probably walked in front of that hotel. I don't know. His father, Watson's father, went to Oberlin for a year. But then I think because of financial problems, had to start working for a living. He worked for a trust company. Then World War II broke out. And he was in the military for a year, but I think didn't do anything particularly traumatic or dramatic. But then got his lifelong job, this is his father, at La Salle Extension University, which was actually one of these correspondence schools. And his job was as the collections manager. All right, but as Watson tells the story, his father was very good at trying to figure out easier way for the students to pay their unpaid bills. So he was in a very morally difficult position, being a good liberal, but at the same point having a job going out and dunning people to pay their debts. His mother had spent 2 years at the University of Chicago, so both his parents were well educated. And then she got a job at the housing office of the University of Chicago. And her mother's claim to fame that she was at one point a precinct captain in one of the Chicago wards for the Democrats. So that was a fairly powerful position to be a Democratic precinct captain in Chicago. So at the age of 11, Watson started going bird watching with his father. Now, his father was avid. He was one of these guys that would frequently get up before the sun came up so he could go out to the parks in Chicago and see what birds were migrating through. And Jim joined him, and he much loved it. He talks about a family trip to San Francisco to see the International Exposition. And what he most remembers is that on the trip, he saw 50 new species of birds. He was a bright kid. So when he was 14 years old, there was a very popular radio and TV show called The Quiz Kids. This is mostly radio. And it was sort of like Jeopardy for kids. And he did very well for the first 2 shows. And then on the 3rd show, the focus was on the Bible and Shakespeare, which was just his downfall. However, he got money, I think a US savings bond for each of the 3 shows that he was on. And he used much of the money to buy a good pair of binoculars for his bird watching. So he did well in this as he started out in high school, but was also avidly interested in birds. Now, the interesting twist to his education is he's there right next to the University of Chicago. His father had met the president of the University of Chicago when they were both students. Now, the connection here is that the president of the University of Chicago at this time was Robert Hutchins. A few of you may have heard of them because this is a very interesting experiment in higher education. Hutchins was only 34 years old when he became president. So Hutchins, the president, was, Hutchinson's father was a contemporary of Jim Watson's father. The two fathers had both been at Oberlin together. And so Jim Watson knew the father and he knew the son who was president of the University of Chicago. And he thought, this is where a good place for my son should go. So that was kind of part of the interest. And so Jim Watson had to write an essay and take an exam. He did very well and he got a full scholarship. Now Watson himself says maybe he owes part of it to his mother who worked there and was very popular, and is also his mother really helped him with this essay. In any case, he got in. He's 15 years old, 1943, and he starts at the university. Now, the reason for this is that it wasn't peculiar to Watson. Hutchins had a couple of very unusual ideas about how to run a university. One was he started this special program with the idea that for some kids, the last 2 years of high school didn't make any sense. They should just come right to the university at age 15. And so Watson was part of this program. His other idea, you may have heard about this, was that the focus should be on the great books. It's kind of the great books of Western civilization. And so that is the kind of program that Watson moved into. And Watson liked it very much. And years later was always very thankful for the early education that he had gotten at the University of Washington. So some of the things he talks about as being an undergrad there is, one thing is they would go to games in some of the old football stadium, et cetera. And there was a lot of rumors around campus that there was some secret war project going on there. Well, as a matter of fact, Enrico Fermi was building the first nuclear reactor in the old squash courts under the University of Chicago Stadium. And that remained a secret for the whole war. He remained a very fervent ornithologist. In 1945, he got a summer job up in Green Bay, Wisconsin at a camp as the nature counselor. But he started taking science courses, took some math, didn't really do well in it, kind of stopped taking the math. Took a course in physiological from genetics from a guy named Sewell Wright, who's a very famous kind of environmental ecological biologist, and he liked that course very much. And then he read this same book that everybody else was reading, What is Life by Schrödinger. And so he got very interested in the idea of genes. He loved birds, but he wanted to know what was underlying the genetic makeup that drove the development and the behavior of birds, and it had to be in their genes. So he graduated from the University of Chicago, 1947. So his war experience was very different from Crick's and Rosalyn Franklin's. He was just a young guy, young student throughout the whole war, and really was not affected much by it. He was 19 years old. And so he applied for graduate school now, for PhD programs, to Caltech, to Harvard, to Indiana. It's kind of his safety school. And partly he picked places where there were young geneticists because he decided that's what he was interested in. He did not get accepted to Caltech. He got accepted to Harvard, but they didn't offer him any money. And Indiana accepted him and offered him a scholarship. His family didn't have a lot of money, so he decided to go to Indiana. One thing in his acceptance letter from Indiana, there was handwritten at the bottom of the letter. It said, if your interests continue in ornithology, it would be best to refuse our offer because we have no graduate instruction in this field. So in other words, if you're interested in birds, Jim, this is not the place to come. All right, but he had already decided he was interested in genetics. That was where his intellectual focus was going to be. So off to Indiana, started taking courses. Early on, took a course from Salvador Luria, a guy who had emigrated from Italy once again, fleeing the Nazis, came to the United States, became a US citizen. Luria at this time was only 35 years old himself. And Luria was talking about genetics using the viruses that infect bacteria. And I want to say just a little bit about this field because it was very important in the development of modern molecular biology. And people of my age kind of remember a lot of this history and knew a lot of these people who were studying these bacterial viruses. I think the young people, it's kind of forgotten history. But there was developing what was called the phage group. What was common to them was they were all ex-physicists. So Luria was one of them. Next, Delbruck, who was at Caltech, was really the leader of the whole gang. Guys' names like Renato Del Becco, Gunther Stent. Those of you who are kind of older biologists have probably heard these names. And as physicists who wanted to figure out the secret of life, they said, let's reduce this to something simple that we can really use physics techniques to study. And so what they landed on was the viruses that infect bacteria, because not a lot was known about them, but it was known that they were very tiny. They were relatively simple, much, much simpler than the simplest cell. That was basically a packet of DNA surrounded by protein. And that this virus could infect the bacterium and it could carry genes with it that would change the shape or the structure or the food that the bacterium ate. And so now we've got some little part, we've got genes, a little gene and packet, and we can study that, and we can do it, and we can study millions of them just on a little petri dish. And so it developed a whole experimental technology, a whole school of thought. It was called the phage school, and Luria was one of the members of the school. I should say that Luria, in the end, won the Nobel Prize for his work in phage genetics. So he landed in a very good place. Now, Watson's particular project was to use X-rays not to study structure, but they knew that X-rays could be damaging. And so if you X-rayed these viruses, would you kill them? Would it change the structure of the genes? Could they still carry genetic information? So he was working on that kind of a problem. And from his thesis work, he produced 2 papers that were really very excellent work. But among other things, from this work, from his involvement with Luria, he got to go to some conferences and he really got to meet the real leaders of the field. I mean, we think of Indiana was a big school, really doing important work, but I grew up in the Midwest and I know that people just fly over the Midwest and I want to defend it. But it's also thought of it maybe as a little bit of a backwater. But they really had excellent people there. And they really participated in the larger US and international community. So in the summer of 48, when he was only 20 years old, he went to Cold Spring Harbor for the first science conference. Now this, to biologists, is a very well-known place. So biologists and especially genetics people had been meeting every year for decades at Cold Spring Harbor. So it was kind of the, not just national, but the international place to find out what's new in molecular biology and to meet and talk with the people who were doing it. So Watson got to go. He met many famous people there. And I should also say, although he was somewhat driven by his sciences, he also started a habit of long vacations. If he went off to a science meeting, he'd also take a good vacation, something that I personally support also. He also, because he met the phage people and he met Max Delbruck, who was kind of the leader of this whole group. And Delbruck invited him to come to a summer to Caltech. And so he did some science there and made some connections and learn the techniques. Now, I don't know if Nancy Mead is here today, but I have to throw this in for Nancy or maybe some other people. One of Watson's impressions of Caltech was based, he liked Caltech, but he was not too fond of Pasadena. He described Pasadena as basically a retirement home. Seemed to be full of just a lot of old people, and there were just not enough pretty girls.
I am here. And so what year was that, Barry?
It was about 48, about
Okay.
2
Yeah,
years.
you know, the characteristic that one of the characteristics of Pasadena that I always heard was a lot of people who were wealthy from the Midwest would have second homes there and then retired there. So I think that's the crowd that he was, and they contributed to Caltech. So if you went to the Caltech dining room or something, you'd meet these associates who were wealthy, retired people from the Midwest, and that could well have influenced his perceptions of the whole place.
Okay, all
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the other characteristic of Watson Crick, Watson, is he seemed to be the perpetual adolescence, as he's interested in genetics and pretty girls.
Not a good place for Caltech would not be good for that because they didn't have any women there at that time.
Okay.
Okay, bad.
Okay. All right. So he finished his PhD. And so now he had to go do a postdoc. He was interested in genes. He wanted to do nucleic acid chemistry. That seemed like the route to genes. So Luria said, all right, I know one of the people who's really doing great biochemistry is in Europe, in Copenhagen, a man named Kalkar. So he got a 2-year, very prestigious Merck fellowship, pay his way for 2 years. And Kalkar said, fine, please come. And when he arrived, Kalkar said, all right, we're studying DNA. And among other things, we want to know how it's made. And we know it's made out of these subunits called nucleotides. And I want you to study the enzymes that make nucleotides. And Watson thought, boring. This is not going to get me to genes. So there was another guy in Copenhagen at a different institute who was working on bacterial viruses. And he started just riding his bicycle over and doing experiments with that guy. Now, what did his boss think about it? Well, it turns out his boss had just gotten divorced and his mind was just everywhere. Kalkar, and Kalkar didn't have to pay for him. Watson had his own money. So he just kind of let Watson do whatever he wanted. But Watson decided, this is not going to solve the genes here. So, what can I do? Well, he went to a science meeting in Italy, and there he met Maurice Wilkins. Here's Wilkins again, Crick's friend, the person at King's who Rosalyn is supposed to be working for or with. And now he runs into Watson at a meeting. So Wilkins, young physicist from London, and he had been doing the very early work on X-ray crystallography, and he had gotten nothing really in terms of structure, but Wilkins had evidence that DNA could form a kind of crystal. And that meant that X-ray crystallography potentially could show its structure. So Watson got very excited about this because he had thought to that point that any detailed structure like that was years into the future. So Watson quickly wrote to Luria back in Indiana and said, look, this is where I got to go. I've got to find somebody where I can do X-ray crystallography on DNA. And so Luria had lots of good friends. And he said, well, best place in the world is go to Cambridge. There's a guy there named John Kendrew. He's doing something like that, but with proteins. So Luria said to Kendrew, hey, I have this bright young guy. He has his own money. Would you take him in Cambridge? And Kendrew said yes. And so off he went. So James Watson arrived in Cambridge in the fall of 1951. He is 23 years old. He was at the Cavendish lab of the Medical Research Council. For biologists, this is like the center of the world. Cavendish lab was directed by Sir Lawrence Bragg, the man who had won the Nobel Prize for X-ray crystallography. One of the senior people there was Max Perutz, who was perhaps the world's best protein structure guy. So even though he just kind of arrived for a visit initially and still had this job back in Copenhagen, he never returned. He never went back. He liked the environment so well, he wrote to New York, say, hey, you gave me this 2-year fellowship, but I really want to work on something else. Is that okay? And New York wrote back and said, no, we gave you the money to work on nucleic acid chemistry in Copenhagen. If you don't spend it for what it was intended for, we're not going to give you the money. So Watson kind of had to use his connections. So we got Luria and Bragg and Perutz. So you got these Nobel Prize winners writing to the money people saying, yeah, you know, he's a bright guy. Let him go, let him go. And so they gave him permission to move his fellowship money to Cambridge. So he arrived at Cambridge, found an office. It was a big room that had room for 4 people. And one of the people that already had a desk in that office was Francis Crick. And Crick loved to talk in a loud way, and so did Watson in a way. And Watson said, I want to find out the secret of life, and I'm going to work on DNA. And Crick said, so do I, you know, and they got talking. And as they say, the rest is history. And so we're going to pick that up next time. Now I'm going to show you just a few pictures here on Watson. Okay. Let me see. Cancel this. Okay. So this is Jim Watson with his father and his sister. Yeah, here he is, 11 years old. Whoops. And here he is on Quiz Kids. And this is Watson here. The other thing was when at this point he was about 5'1" tall, and then he grew 11 inches in like 3 years. Sometimes he finished college when he was still very young. He was nearly 6 feet tall. So then he went to the University of Chicago, you know, at the age of 15, and finished in 3 years and finished at 18. And just this one slide here about the phage school, just to illustrate the point. So phage, which are bacterial viruses, are really not much more than a protein coat packed with DNA or RNA. And they come in different shapes, but in all cases, they just have this nucleic acid inside, a protein on the outside.
Hello, this is Kelly from Alignment Health Plan. I spoke to your pharmacy, Cheryl, and it looks like a couple medications are overdue to be filled. One of your diabetic medications and your cholesterol medication. So if you can give them a call and get you the medication, it's recommended. So you just
got there.
we just want to make sure everything's okay.
It's Lois Widows.
Oh, okay.
Or can provide an update.
I will turn
My
that
number
on.
is 844-310.
Okay. Let me just finish this last picture here. Okay. Yeah. It won't allow me to do the mute command when I'm in full screen. Okay. So what happens with these bacterial viruses is that they bind to the outer part of a bacterium, and then they inject something into the cell. And at the time, it wasn't known whether it's the protein or the DNA that went in here. That really got worked out just a little bit after Watson and Crick and Franklin made their big discoveries. I like this picture because it kind of shows you the relative size. Bacteria are very tiny by themselves, but these phage are just even tinier. And you can see the appeal of the physicist is it's just a pure little packet of DNA here. Okay, and so my final picture is, so here's where our story stands now. Watson has just met Crick, and they are at Cambridge University, and they are out to discover the secret of life. and neither of them have been very successful as experimenters. But Rosalyn Franklin is just 60 miles away in London, busily doing X-ray crystallography on DNA, which is what they want to study also. And so how all this works is something that I am going to cover in our lecture number 3 next time. So questions about any of this here?
I have another connection.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to think of her name. There was a woman in Lifelong Learners, very active. I don't know what's happened to her, but she entered University of Chicago at 15, and she probably is about the same age as Watson. And then there is a woman here at Dominican Oaks who also started University of Chicago at 15. And I will ask her the next time I'm eating with her whether she knew Watson, because he was born in 1928, did you say?
28, yep.
So about my age. Anyway, we may have another connection to those guys.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Oh, Roger.
I have a comment and a question, if I may. The comment is, you mentioned Schrödinger a couple of times, and of course, he's the founder of quantum mechanics. But most people would agree he didn't do too much after that. But then he wrote this hugely influential book, which you mentioned, all of them had read. And the comment is Richard Feynman, who said that Schrödinger is the Harry Truman of physics. Neither man was obviously marked for greatness, but they really came through when their hour came. So I thought that was an interesting comment. The question is, Schrödinger at the time, during the war and about for 15 years after the war, had moved to Ireland, not that far from where these people were. And I was wondering if they had contact with him, if that's known.
I've never seen that come up in any of the books. It really was just reading the book. I don't know. I don't know if he ever showed up at any of the meetings. One thing, the book by author talked about Crick. He mentions that a contemporary reader, if you look at that book by Schrödinger, would say, "Oh, why is this so interesting?"
Yeah.
So it has aged badly, but you have to put yourself in the context of what was known at the time. They knew nothing. So
I agree. I read the book and it didn't seem that earth-shattering to me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other questions here?
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
You mentioned Watson went to this lecture from Rosalyn.
Mm-hmm.
How did that fit in time-wise relative to Watson and Crick getting together?
It was very soon after Watson arrived, so it was kind of at the beginning of the story, and so I will put that timeline together in the next talk.
Great.
Okay. Other questions here?
Barry, this is a little off topic, but I find it interesting that Roslyn has a part to play in this, and that the coronavirus was discovered by a woman in 1965 who was a electron microscope technician. So, women found a way back then to get involved in science, which I think is a testament, because they sure ran into a lot of obstacles trying to pursue that.
That is correct.
Tell people about that. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And so we've come to the precipice here of the key story. So next time we're going to talk about how all 3 of these people interacted over this critical 2 to 3 year period in Cambridge and London. And it's a one of the cool stories in science. So I hope to see you all again next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.